So please join me in welcoming Dick Leinenkugel.
Thank you so much. So what she had asked for was money. Yeah, told her we didn't have any. Thank you. Thanks for welcoming me, and thank you for remaining here until 2 o'clock. I do want to finish with that sixth-generation leadership story, but I'm going to start by taking you back all the way to the founding family. And I'll weave in some of the stories, and I think most of them are true. They've been passed down through the generations, but it's somewhat a story that I think many of you perhaps are going through. I had some great conversations at lunch. And as Commerce Secretary, I got to meet so many businesses and so many family-owned businesses as well, that I just think that when I was asked to come here and keynote and be part of today, I said yes, because I believe in the mission of family business forums. UW Oshkosh has been a leader in this area for many, many years, and of course UW-Madison has a great one as well. So thank you for being here and for wanting to learn more about family business and for being here and sharing your stories, not only with me but with others. And thank you, of course, to the sponsors. Of course, without them we wouldn't have been able to put this on. I also returned to UW Oshkosh, and I just, while you were at your 1 o'clock session, I love to use Twitter. I'm not as prolific as our nation's leader, but I do use Twitter mostly for business, but sometimes I'll comment on other issues, and I did send a tweet. I'm at Dick Leine, by the way, if any of you use Twitter and want to follow me. I did send a tweet. I said, back here at UW Oshkosh, Family Business Forum, and kind of thinking of two of my children who graduated, and I said, from UW-0, affectionately, of course, and are not living in my basement. They have real jobs. But interestingly, one of my children is living in my basement currently, as we speak. She's the one that went to UW, not UW, she went to the U, Minnesota, graduated in 3.5 years, becomes a teacher for Teach for America. They send her on to her graduate degree program because they want to keep her in the program as an administrator. She becomes a grade school principal at the age of 25. Does that for 3 years and says, I want to get into business. She goes and gets her MBA from the University of Texas, graduates last May, and is still out looking for a job while she's living in my basement. So that's the story of my daughter, Katie. Perhaps another generation family member that can come into our business. But before we get there, this is a cheap presenter's trick to keep all of you awake. Let me play a video. So I don't know about you, but I'm thirsty. Should we adjourn to across the street? So I grew up there in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and it was a great place to grow up. And it's 3 hours away from here. If any of you are from this area and want to come and see us in Chippewa Falls, I would suggest Highway 10, stop in Clintonville, pick up a coffee or a six-pack, not to drink in the car, at another great family-owned business, a quick trip, and then head on up to 29. You can be there in 2 hours and 45 minutes with one gas stop. But please do come and see us in Chippewa Falls, where I grew up. I didn't work in the brewery until I was 17. I was a paper boy first for the Minneapolis Tribune, and then worked across the street from where I grew up at an A&W root beer stand. So that was my first job pouring beer, the other kind. But I did learn how to pour 6 mugs at a time. That was pretty cool if you could do that. So I did that, and then when I was 17, my dad asked if I wanted to give tours for the summer, and we gave tours from Memorial Day to Labor Day, from 9, 10, and 11, 1, 2, and 3. Whoever showed up, we took on a tour. It could be 2 people, it could be 50 people. We took them on a tour of the brewery, and back then we only had a little sternaward, a little closet, a bar that maybe was 4 feet long, and you could sit back there and have a cold, refreshing glass of Leinenkugels beer to start your tour or at the end of the tour. When I wasn't giving a tour, I was answering the can mail. You may say, what's the can mail? Well, the can mail was beer can collectors. It was really in vogue in 1975, and I especially remember Des Plaines, Illinois, and St. Charles, Missouri. I think were the epicenters of collecting beer cans, because we used to ship out air-filled beer cans if they sent us $1. So I would pack up the cans and send them out and then book that $1. That's how I started in the beer business. The following year, I actually stapled cases, returnable boxes. You folded them, stapled them on a stapling gun machine, and stacked them, took them out to the brewery. Back then, most of our business was returnable bottles of beer, and you had to replenish that stock. Especially most of the college kids would use it as furniture, so you had to make new ones. And that's what I did in the summer. It was a great job because I worked from 3:30 until midnight with a half-hour break. 2 of us were on the job. And the bottle house superintendent went home at 4:30. The bottle shop shuts down at 5. So when that superintendent went home, we went and snuck a couple of bottles off of the line, put it in the fridge so that we could enjoy that at midnight when we punched out. Now, we got really good making returnable boxes. In fact, we could make the 500 that we were told to make or supposed to make every day. We got so good that we could do it in about 4 hours. Now, do you think we went and made an additional 500? Not on Thursday or Friday night. Nobody was there. We went and sampled some beers for about 4 hours. Responsibly, of course. That's how I started in the beer business. Next year, I came back, went and served as a driver's assistant. So I delivered beers. And that was a great learning experience in terms of going to the bars, taverns, restaurants, supermarkets, grocery stores, and delivering beers. And getting to talk to customers and meeting our consumers that were drinking our beers at the bars. Following year, I worked in the bottle shop. And then when I graduated from Marquette in 1980, went in the Marine Corps. I tell you that story because we didn't start, necessarily at the top of the company. We were right there learning the business. In fact, I was a teamster to work in the brewery. We were a union shop, and I had to join the union. We ate our lunch in the lunchroom with the employee workers. And our dad always told us, because your last name is Leinenkugel, you have to work harder than anybody else because everybody's watching you. They're looking at you to see what you do. So that was a great lesson that he taught us, and I'll talk about some of my dad's lessons today. So after Marquette, where I graduated with a marketing degree, I went into the Marine Corps, and somebody asked me, why did you choose the Marines? I said, well, one of the reasons was they had a scholarship program called Naval ROTC. So I applied for that, got it. I didn't want to ask my parents for any money, and I got to go to a great school like Marquette. After 4 years at Marquette, when you graduate as a second lieutenant. You're commissioned, went into active duty. It was a great time to be in the Marines. It was just coming off post-Vietnam era, but Reagan had just gotten elected, in 1980, and he was spending to basically spend the Soviet Union out of existence. So my salary went from $11,000 in 1980 to $21,000 by the time I got out in 1984. So not only did he restore a lot of pride to the military, but also was a fabulous time. I think part of it too, being a ground supply officer, I got my first choice of duty station, which was Hawaii. I went to Kaneohe Bay. I deployed twice on board naval ships and got to see the world as a young Marine. Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines. Diego Garcia went to Oman, Somalia, and Africa. So, you know, as a 23, 24-year-old officer, what a great experience that was for me. Now, coming out of the Marine Corps, my brother Jake had left his career in the Marines as part of my dad's succession plan in 1982. He came out of the Marines to come into the brewery. And at that time, 1984, when I decided not to pursue the Marines as a career, the company, you know, really wasn't that big. It wasn't like they could take on another family member. So I actually was looking at a number of different opportunities, mostly with major companies that recruited military junior officers. So Procter & Gamble, Texas Instruments, Mobil Chemical, Behringer Winery, all of those companies, I was looking at positions with them. And ended up, my dad came over Christmas of 1983, my dad and mom, and I took them out golfing. We went over to Maui and I took them out golfing. My dad and I were at twosome, hooked up with a guy named Steve Lesnick and his son Josh. Josh was, I don't know, 8 years old at the time. I was, you know, in my 20s, my dad and Steve, and we were a foursome. Found out that Steve Lesnick had started a company called Kemper Sports Management. They were in the golf business, men's and women's Kemper Open golf tournaments. They also ran golf courses. Steve was a former advertising manager for Kemper insurance companies, and he and Jim Kemper Jr. took this company private to run the sports business. And Steve explained to me that his director of the Women's Kemper Open was leaving his position. Would you be interested in becoming the tournament director for the Women's Kemper Open? It all happened over a round of golf. And I said, yeah, sounds like a great job. It means I'd be in Hawaii during the winter for the next 3 years. So incredible opportunity. That's where I took that role with Kemper Sports Management. Leaving Kemper then, I joined the family business at Leinenkugels. I'll tell that story a little bit later on. As mentioned, took a step out of the family business in 2008, and I'll explain why. And actually became Commerce Secretary for the state of Wisconsin, and then came back into the family business. And at that time, my brother Jake said, you know, I'm okay with letting Dick back into the business, but I think he should start back on the bottling line. True story, by the way. I didn't, but actually started in a mergers and acquisitions role with 10th and Blake, which was the craft and import division of Miller Coors, our corporate parent. And then in 2014, when my brother Jake retired from the Jacob Leinenkugel Brewing Company, I was announced as his successor, and that's the chair that I sit in today. So I want to take you back just through a little bit of the family history, and I'll start back with these 5 gentlemen. To the right is Jacob. So that's Jacob Leinenkugel and his brothers. They came over from Germany in 1843. Now at that time, Jacob was only 3 years old. 1845, sorry. Jake was 3 years old when he came and settled in Sauk City, Wisconsin. That's where his dad, Matthias, brought the family. And back then, Sauk City was a major hop growing area for the state of Wisconsin. They were supplying the hops that were going to the breweries in Milwaukee, Chicago, and St. Louis. So a lot of Germans settled in Wisconsin, of course. It was a lot like their homeland, kind of the same latitude, same climate, looked a lot like Germany, so they were very comfortable there. And Matthias trained all of these guys in becoming biotechnology entrepreneurs. They had that little single-cell organism called yeast, which if you add it to a maltose sugar from the brewing process actually causes fermentation and produces ethanol, which we know today as alcohol. That's in beer. So I'd like to say that they were all entrepreneurs and were all in the biotechnology business very early on in the 1800s. So Jacob went to work in his brother's brewery in Eau Claire in 1866, along with his boyhood friend John Miller, no relation to Frederick. They met in Sauk City, and Jake went to work at the brewery with John, and they established the Spring Brewery. Now, they came to Chippewa Falls because Chippewa at the time had the largest sawmill under one roof, 2,500 lumberjacks that were working in this sawmill. So all of the white pine lumber that was being mined in northwest Wisconsin would float down the Chippewa River. It would get dammed up. They would pull the logs out, run it through the big mill to make the rough board feet that was building the great city of Chicago. Eau Claire had a lot of lumber mills, as did Menominee as well, but the one in Chippewa Falls was the largest. And there was no brewery in Chippewa Falls. Eau Claire already had 5 breweries. So Jacob, being the bright brewer and John being his business partner, decided to establish the Spring Brewery in Chippewa Falls. Back then you could only take beer as far as a horse could take it in a day, which was about 20 miles. So that's why these guys, I think, were successful in establishing that business in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Jacob started his family. His son Matt, his son William, and his daughters Rose and Susan all would play a role in the brewery, but the most important person in that photo up there is Josephine, Jacob's wife. She was the hardest worker, without a doubt. Had to cook 3 meals a day for 30 brewery workers, had to do all the mending, all the sewing, all the cooking. No doubt was the doctor and the nurse. She literally worked herself to death, died at age 43. But Josephine, that brewery up in Chippewa Falls today wouldn't exist without Josephine. And interestingly, the women, both Rose and Susan, came back to play a role in the brewery as well. William died at a very young age, 27, and Matt assumed control in running the brewery, Jacob's son, upon Jacob's death in 1899. In 1888, this is when this photo is. Somebody mentioned to me today, you know, Dick, I love your Leinenkugels Bock beer. And we first produced Leinenkugels Bock in 1888. That was the crew of brewery workers. You see the building behind that. That building is still existing in our brewery today. That's our brewery's malt house. But no doubt a great group of gentlemen that worked in the brewery and brewed back then what we call today craft beer, our Leinenkugels Bock in 1888. This is what the brewery looked like in the 1890s. And you can see the 2 family homes, one for the Millers, John Miller's family, and Jacob's family home. Now, Jacob actually bought out John in 1883, and they remained friends until Jacob died or until John passed away. I think John passed away first, and then Jacob passed away. And they remained very close friends, even though Jacob bought out his portion of the business. Those homes, interestingly, still exist in Chippewa Falls, not on the site of the brewery, but one is across the street and one is about a mile away from the brewery. That is the brew house that Jacob built in 1890. So he put a lot of capital into the brewery to build a brew house in 1890, that 3 or 4-story building that you see there. And then to the building just to the right of that, that's connected by the pipe bridge, is the malt house. And the malt house was built and opened in 1881. So certainly a historic site where we're still brewing beer today. The next generation took over the brewery upon Jacob's death in 1899. And it was Jacob's son, Matt, and his sons-in-laws that took over the business. So Rose and Susan, Jacob's daughters, and their husbands were also involved in the business. So at that time, three families: the Casper family, the Meyer family, and the Leinenkugel family were in equal shares of, at that time called, the J. Leinenkugel Brewing Company, right at the turn of the century. Now, something happened in 1919 that caused our family to rethink the business: Prohibition. So the government actually said, nope, sorry, you're brewers, you can't produce beer, you can't sell beer, you can't manufacture beer. So what's the family to do? I think if nothing else, this family has always been resilient. They said, we're going to keep it an ongoing concern, and it was probably out of necessity. By then, there were three families involved in the business. There were certainly other mouths to feed, and the family said, we're going to keep this business. Hopefully this is a short-term situation with Prohibition, and that someday we'll be able to get back into brewing beer. It was really interesting. We celebrated our 150th anniversary last year. We did a great book. Still have some for sale if you'd like to give it out as a Christmas gift. Go to Leine.com. I'm a salesman at heart. But in doing the research for the book, I read about what the family did during Prohibition, and they did interesting things. They brewed a malt tonic. So most brewers who stayed in business did this, and malt was supposedly good for you. This tonic, they touted that it had some health benefits. They brewed a near beer, a beer without alcohol, which probably wasn't very good. It wasn't successful. It was called Lino. But what was a success were the sodas and the mixers. And one of the mixers was called Kist Sparkling Sour. And I saw an advertisement for it from the 1920s. And it was, Jacob Leinenkugel Brewing Company, Kist Sparkling Sour, mixes well with everything. I'm going, well, what were they mixing it with? So no doubt people were making something in their bathtubs or wherever they were making it, but it probably wasn't that good, and they needed something to mix it with. Thus, Leinenkugel's Ginger Ale, Royal Palm Ginger, and Kist Sparkling Sour were very successful products, as were the sodas. And we stayed in the soft drink business all the way up until the 1950s. We actually bottled sodas into the 1950s. Coming out of Prohibition in 1933, it was the third generation of the family. So Bill Casper, the son of Henry Casper and Rose Leinenkugel Casper, came out of a banking career. He's the gentleman to the left, banking career in Milwaukee. And Ray Meyer, the son of John Meyer and Susan Meyer, came and started the brewery. Before I get to 1933 in the third generation, though, Susan Meyer actually assumed the reins of the company as its president in 1926 when Matt Leinenkugel, the second generation, passed away. And both Susan Meyer and Catherine Leinenkugel, the widow of Matt Leinenkugel, mortgaged their homes in 1933 to raise the capital to get the brewery up and operating again. I read a report from Siebel Institute, which basically laid out what the family needed to do to get the company back into the brewing business, and they needed to raise capital to do that. And both women were the ones to raise the money to allow the family to get back into business by mortgaging their homes. So Bill Casper and John Meyer returned. My dad's dad, the third generation, was a lawyer. He actually came back and did the legal paperwork to get the brewery up and operating, but he was operating out in Washington, D.C., worked for the federal government. So Jacob Leinenkugel, my grandfather, was not directly involved in the operation of the business at that time. In 1946, after World War II, my dad, Bill Leinenkugel, came into the business. And my dad told the story that when he got out of the Marines, went to Carroll College at the time to become an accountant. And my dad said he wasn't a very good student. And I have this great photo of him actually studying accounting, but I think he liked beer a lot better. So he approached Ray Meyer, who was running the company, and Bill Casper, and he went to Ray, was the general operating manager, and he went to Ray and he said, I'd like to become part of the family and become a salesperson for you. So my dad spent over 40 years in the business, but he started in sales. And as my dad went around and met people and worked distributors and worked accounts and met people and sold beer, he was just a great ambassador for the brand and for the brewery. Everybody knew Bill Leinenkugel in northwest Wisconsin and certainly in Chippewa Falls. And I just think it was, he had so much to do in terms of building the business to what it is today. When he took over the reins from Bill Casper, Bill moved into the chairman's role, and my dad became brewery president in 1971. It was really a difficult time for small family-owned breweries that were in business during the 1970s. And there were quite a few here in Wisconsin, and most of them went out of business or changed hands. Oshkosh here, Chief Oshkosh, and Rhinelander, and Potosi, and there was one in Sheboygan, forget the name there, but most of them were gone. And the model back then was Heilemann was buying up most of the labels. They would take the production, still produce the beer, but they would produce it in La Crosse. And my dad actually started to do some things a little bit differently. He was one of the first entrepreneurs, I think, or one of the first small brewers to actually use television advertising. He always said, you got to keep your local market strong. If you want to, remain in business, you got to be part of the local community, keep your local market strong, and also stay really close to your customer, stay close to your distributors. And I still remember my dad driving me down to Milwaukee, and what should be a 4-hour drive was always a 6-hour drive, because he said you don't pass a distributorship without stopping. So it was a stop in Baraboo to see our distributor there, and it was a stop in Jefferson to see our distributor there. And naturally, my dad would have a bottle of beer, use the bathroom, and then we would be on our way back to Milwaukee. But that was another lesson. Don't stop or don't pass your distributor without seeing your distributor. Something that I would recommend to you that are in a family business, if you haven't done it yet, do an interview with your founder, or if you are the founder, have somebody do an interview with you and tell your story. It's so important to get that. We actually did that with my dad in 1995. We had somebody come in, and we have 88 minutes of film, just my dad answering some questions about the business. And it's been useful because we've used it in training, we've used it with our sales teams, we've used it in customer videos. We have him, the fourth generation, telling the story. So some of the excerpts from that video I wanted to share with you today. This was a story that was actually produced upon my dad's death in 2008. So let's roll the tape.
No industry has captured the essence of Wisconsin quite like the brewing industry, and no person has symbolized that essence quite like Bill Leinenkugel. A lifetime in the beer business carried him from prohibition to national recognition. from horse-drawn beer delivery wagons to computerized distribution. And through it all, Bill Leinenkugel remained loyal to the family business, just like the 3 generations that came before him and the one that now follows in his footsteps.
There was a great family pride, and you didn't really do it for the money. You did it for the name and the pride of keeping a small company going.
During his high school years, Bill Leinenkugel spent summers working in the family business, first in the soda plant, then the brewery. In 1941, his brewing career was interrupted by World War II. After 5 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, Bill returned to Wisconsin and enrolled in college to learn accounting. What he learned instead was that he was better suited for the beer business. So he went back to the brewery in 1947 as a traveling salesman, beginning a 20-year odyssey that would take him to virtually every outpost in the North Woods.
I always carried a roll of toilet paper because you didn't have the modern facilities today, these rest stops. And if you did have a rest stop along a county road, it was usually an outdoor john.
It was also 1947 when Bill got married and started a family. 2 daughters came first, followed by the 3 sons who would become the 5th generation of Leinenkugel family brewers. Bill became Leine's sales and advertising manager in 1966, and in 1971, after 3 decades of honing his craft, Bill Leinenkugel inherited the reins of his family's historic brewery. Under Bill's innovative leadership, the small brewery experienced record growth and notoriety. In 1978, Newsweek magazine called Leine's the best of the local brands and featured a photo of Bill in blinders doing a taste test. After negotiating a 1987 joint operating agreement with Miller Brewing Company, Bill Leinenkugel decided it was time to enjoy retirement. He stepped down content that he was leaving the brewery in good hands, that the family legacy would continue. Bill remained a brewery fixture for the rest of his life, a proud patriarch, happy to share experience and wisdom.
It was my fondest dream before I die that you 3 boys would be associated with the Leinenkugel Brewing Company.
For more than half a century, Bill Leinenkugel rubbed shoulders with the giants of the beer industry. He watched as competitors came and went.
Been a lot of changes, but we have persevered.
Bill Leinenkugel had a lot to be proud of. But when asked to sum up his legacy, his humble reply was simply that he helped keep the brewery alive. Bill Leinenkugel was 87 years old.
In 1982, my brother Jake left the Marines. This was us in Korea when we were both over there and ran into each other. And there was no formal succession plan. My dad, in his mind, had a succession plan, but he really hadn't talked and gotten anything done with the Meyer side of the family, who were also involved in the business. And Bill Casper, same gentleman who came back in 1933, who had left his banking career, was chairman of the board. And so Bill was in his mid-80s at that time and was the principal stockholder, with the Leinenkugel family having a third and the Meyer family having a third. There was a board, all made up of family members, all representing one of those families. The Meyer family, the Casper family, or the Leinenkugel family. But my dad knew that he needed to have somebody with the name, especially, in the business that could learn the business and sell beer. That's what my brother Jake did. Now, coming out of the golf business in 1987, I was living in Chicago at the time, and I saw what was starting to happen in the beer business at the time, which was all these microbrewed beers at the time. That's what we called them, not craft brews. And I said, I think it would be a lot of fun to open up Chicago and start calling on the chain stores and see if we could really start to build Leinenkugels in Chicago like my brother Jake had done in Minneapolis. So I approached my dad and my brother about establishing a sales rep position in Chicago. But not everybody was in favor of that. This was a family-owned business, and you were bringing on another family member into the business. I had put together a plan. I had put together, obviously I had some experience in business and sports marketing. I was a Marine. I knew I could do the job, but it went to a board vote. And from what my dad told me, it was not unanimous. But I did have the support of the chairman. And I guess a lesson learned is when you have the support of the chairman and the majority stockholder, then usually something will work out. So they hired me. My brother hired me. And I started work in the beer business. It was about 4 months after that my dad called me. It was in September. I started in May. And he said, Dick, we have this letter from Miller Brewing Company. They're proposing a joint marketing venture. He goes, what do you think? I said, well, I think you should talk to them. They're a great brewer, Wisconsin-based. Find out what they want. And I said, Dad, I'll land on my feet. You don't have to worry about me. I mean, I'll be fine. And so they went and talked to Miller Brewing Company and representatives at the time. And prior to that, though, my dad takes this letter down to Bill Casper. Now, Bill is our chairman of the board. He's 87 years old, been around the brewery since the end of Prohibition. He reads this letter, he looks up at my dad, he says, what do you think they want? And my dad said, I think they want us to buy them. Well, it was the other way around. But we negotiated a sale to Miller Brewing. And what was important about that sale was they wanted to keep the family involved. The legacy and heritage of the brand was inextricably tied to the value of the brand. And they wanted to keep the brewery operating in Chippewa Falls. And they wanted to build upon the legacy that we had established through 4 and now the 5th generation of the family. So if you can, find a strategic partner that is like that, that's willing to do that, I think, that's a terrific fit for many companies. Now, it hasn't always been smooth. Miller Brewing Company at the time was owned by Philip Morris. They later sold to SAB Miller, and formed a joint venture with SAB Miller. And now most recently with Molson Coors. What's interesting about being part of Molson Coors is that now we're part of a bigger family business, the Molson family and the Coors family. They get it. They get the power of the name and the family businesses and family businesses. So I think being part of that gives us a lot of headway in terms of bringing on the next generation of the family. And when I assumed the position in 2014 as the president of the company, one of my 3 goals is directly related to succession planning and ensuring that the next generation of the family, the 6th generation, that's my brother John up front, I'm to the right, brother Jake all the way to the back, but all those other family members are all the next generation of the family. We've even added some. We've lost a couple in there now too. One of them actually went to work for a import brewer, Jake's son CJ, which I think is okay because he's going to get an experience that he wouldn't have gotten had he stayed on the domestic side of the business. So CJ, kudos to him for wanting to kind of branch out, spread his wings. And you got to be open to that, I think, as well. You can always come back. But I think if there's an opportunity where you can go out and get some experience, somewhat like I did with the state of Wisconsin as its Commerce Secretary, I think you got to be open to that in family business as well. So that's my job. Besides running the business, I view my job as getting the next generation ready to assume managerial leadership with the Jacob Leinenkugel Brewing Company. So ladies and gentlemen, it has been terrific to be with you here today. I invite you to take that 3-hour trip if you're from this area to come up and see us in Chippewa Falls. I'll give you a couple of really good dates to do that. One is Father's Day weekend. You can come up on Saturday. We do our Leinie Lodge family reunion. And it's brats, bands, and beer. Everything's free. So come on up and see us on that Saturday. Bring your dad. It's a great Father's Day gift. for Father's Day weekend on that Saturday. Another nice time to come to Chippewa Falls is during our Oktoberfest celebration in Chippewa Falls. Generally, that second or third weekend in September. Beautiful weekend to come up and wear your lederhosen and dirndls and be part of a festive activity and hoist some steins of Leinenkugels Oktoberfest. Thanks for coming. I'm open for questions. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Did he bring samples? That's all. I want to know if he brought Leinie samples.
Yeah, Leinie samples are in my trunk. Of course. You know, my dad always carried a cold case of beer besides that roll of toilet paper. And the reason he did that, you know, back then he would stop and, you know, if there was a county road crew out and he would ask, he'd stop. If he saw a farmer in his field, he'd stop and hand him a cold bottle of Leinenkugels beer. Yes, sir.
I went to Stout in the late 60s and early 70s and came from the eastern side of the state and had to go through Chippewa Falls to get to Stout, of course, right through Chippewa Falls at that time. And when I got to Stout, I was introduced to Leining, what? We couldn't even pronounce it, you know, I'd never heard of it before.
Right.
And I mean, so apparently it wasn't distributed very far, even that long ago. But at that time, most of the bars in Stout, which were numerous, served Leinies, and we most commonly drank them out of the 7-ounce bottles, returnable bottles.
Sure.
We called them shorties.
Yep.
And you know, all the manufacturers, all the beer brewers made them in those small bottles. And at the time, a Pabst was a quarter, a Bud was a quarter, an Old Style, and all the other major brands were a quarter. Leinies were 15 cents. Mm-hmm. So we got very fond of Leinenkugels beer at Stout at that time. But I guess my question is, at what point, who was the marketing genius that took Leinenkugels past all of the rest of these big brands at the time, or at least the ones that, you know, Pabst and all the rest of those that were the more expensive beers, and has brought it to more of a national recognition and a beer that commands a much better price now than it did back then. But whoever that marketing genius was, I think, did a heck of a job.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, it wasn't me. You know, timing, I think one of your other speakers today said timing is everything. And it was a very different industry, certainly in the 60s and 70s, where there were these little pockets of small breweries and you kind of competed on price because you had to. And plus, you know, hopefully you didn't have to ship your beer as far as you could, so you could compete on price. What happened in the industry, though, as the big guys got bigger and faster and used their economies of scale, so Pabst, Schlitz, Budweiser, Miller, with their high-speed can lines and high-speed bottling lines, they were reducing their costs. And now that allowed them to go into the so-called sovereign territory of the small brewer and actually charge less and use price promotion. And the price wars of between Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser, and Schlitz at the time in the early 70s were notorious. The small brewers who tried to compete on price and tried to match them went out of business. My dad actually started to raise price on Leinenkugels at that time. Now, we still had to keep the lights going, and he actually came out with a lower price beer called Chippewa Pride. Yep. That was $2.98 a case. You know, and when I was 18, I used to drive to Eau Claire to the local speedway, the Super America, that sold it, you know, just to get that $2.98 price. But so you still had to use your brewery, you know, you had to use that fixed asset, but we actually raised our price and started to command a premium. It was in 1986 that the beer industry was starting to change in the 80s. And this is where the timing aspect comes in, is that consumers are being introduced to different styles of beers. So Jim Cook had started Boston Beer Company, and the Widmer brothers out west, and Shipman started Red Hook, and Ken Grossman started Sierra Nevada. And these guys were saying, we're making a better beer. We're going to charge a little bit more for it. We came out with a beer called Leinenkugels Limited, which was a limited edition, only produced so much, and started to charge more for it, and sold out. In 1992, we said we're going to do a special beer for our 125th anniversary. We're only going to do 2,000 cases of it. It was going to be in a special box. We're going to put a certificate in there that was signed and numbered by my brother Jake. And that was our 125th anniversary dark lager. And we charged $12.99 for it. I was selling the chain stores in Chicago. Unheard of at the time. For 12-pack of beer, $12.99, but people bought it. We sold out. It's a limited edition, very special beer. That beer became Leinenkugels Red Lager. And Red Lager was really our first entry into what at that time was specialty brewing or microbrewing. And that's what's got us to elevate our price and start to get into what is today called craft brewing. So no genius, it was timing. And some good decisions made along the way. Thank you for sharing your story. Yes, ma'am.
You can talk loud. Okay.
So I view the expansion of craft breweries in the United States, or in the United States, and certainly here in Wisconsin, as a positive thing. So first and foremost, it's introducing people to beer in new and interesting ways. You know, we were a brewer that made the same style of beer, and we still make that beer today. It's called Leinenkugels Original, but it was the same style that Pabst was, and Budweiser, and Schlitz, and you know, all those legacy breweries made that pale yellow German lager style beer. That was it. There were a few different beers. I mean, we did Bock in the spring, as did most breweries, and every now and then there was a cream ale or something like that. But so I brew the craft beer business as kind of reawakening everybody's awareness and styles of beer. Now, competitively, there is somebody in the southwest part of the state that has done very, very well. And they're a leader right now in Wisconsin. They actually sell more beer than we do in Wisconsin, New Glarus. So, you know, kudos to Deb and Dan Carey for what they have done here in the state of Wisconsin, and they're only in Wisconsin. But they have done a wonderful job in terms of marketing their beer. They've chosen, none of their children are going to get into the business, so that's an interesting family story, and one that I've seen now with the second generation of the craft brewers that are starting. Many of them have made strategic sales at some unbelievable multiples. If we had gotten that multiple back in 1988, you wouldn't see me here today. I'd be running that golf tournament in Hawaii. Actually, I would be the person playing. But, so that's what's happened to many of those businesses. Others are doing ESOPs, and some are now getting it into the second generation. Sierra Nevada, that's their strategy. Ken Grossman, who started Sierra Nevada in 1980, his son and his daughter are now involved in the business. So I view it as positive. Yes, sir.
From a management point of view, how do you allocate decision-making between you and the strategic partner, particularly like at a strategic level, and maybe a comment on a tactical level? How do you allocate decision-making? Who gets to make the decisions, I guess, about
Yeah, sure. Yeah, who has decision rights, right? So it changes, and it has changed throughout the years. It's changed when I assumed leadership in 2014. So prior to that, we operated quote-unquote independently. Jake, as president, oversaw operations, brewing in Chippewa Falls, had finance, and had sales and marketing reporting up to him. Now, we used the sales arm of Miller Coors. That's one of the great advantages. They have people everywhere. They can call on distributors everywhere. But at times we had dedicated salespeople as well, and I ran that team. Marketing I ran for many years. When I left the company, marketing went into Miller Coors. So Miller Coors was doing marketing. Then in 2010, we become part of the craft import arm of Miller Coors, which is called 10th and Blake. So they actually assume sales and marketing, with Jake having a direct line reporting relationship into the head of 10th and Blake, but still running and planning and running the business independently. 2014 comes in, I take over for Jake. The CEO of Miller Coors, or Molson Coors at the time, does not want me, Miller Coors at the time, doesn't want me to run the business, the brewing end of things, the operation end of things, wants me to be focused on sales and marketing and getting the next generation trained. So I gave up the brewing end of things. We still have the brewery, but it doesn't report into me. I influence marketing and have input into sales and marketing and assist them and help them. I have the decision rights on what we call our heritage portfolio. That belongs to me. The Shandy portfolio belongs to somebody else. I influence it, I help them, I guide them, but I have direct responsibility for what we call our heritage brands. So all of our seasonal brands, Canoe Paddler, Oktoberfest, Snowdrift, Vanilla Porter, and then our year-round brands, Honey Vice, Original, Light, Creamy Dark, Sunset Wheat, Wisconsin Red Pale Ale. Those fall under me. It's convoluted, not always simple, not always clean, and it may change depending on the CEO of the company. Hope that's an answer for you. Okay. Anything else? Yes, sir. Where are your products produced? So we produce Leinenkugels beers in 3 breweries. Chippewa Falls, actually 4 breweries. Chippewa Falls are the original site. The Leinenkugels 10th Street Brewery in Milwaukee, which has just undergone an expansion in Milwaukee. I'll be there tomorrow. Miller, Milwaukee, the Legacy Miller plant on State Street in Milwaukee, does a lot of our shandy, as well as some of our seasonal brands. And then, most recently, Fort Worth, Texas, with summer shandy only. We started brewing Leinenkugel summer shandy for the southern tiers out of Fort Worth. There is a 5th brewery, Montreal. We started selling Leinenkugels in Canada last summer, our Leinenkugel summer shandy. And they're brewing it up there. Other questions? Yes, sir. How do Canadians pronounce Leinenkugel? Just like that. Unless you're in Quebec. Eh? No, I don't know. Yeah. You know what's interesting about Canada is, what is there? There's 35 million people, right? It's small. More people live in LA, I think, right? So, but they're good beer consumers. They love beer. And interestingly, most of them get to the United States at some point. So there was quite a familiarity, especially with our summer shandy. So they knew about us. Yes, sir.
Back to a question, I guess, related to running a family business. Second question, I'd like whatever you could say about it is, what was your capital structure like before the partnership? How did you fund the business? Was it primarily bank loans? Did you go to private equity at times for equity capital? What kind of structure was used to let the company grow?
Yeah, prior to 1987, you were lean and mean, and hopefully you had a profit. We didn't have any debt, and we were Germans, and I don't think they went to banks. You funded it out of your dividends. Yeah, whatever was left was dividends, and I think that was one of the reasons we were attractive also to a strategic partner, is that there was no debt. After 87, Miller Brewing Company became our bank. Things got a whole lot easier in terms of funding growth. Today, we compete with any other project that's part of Molson Coors, which is a publicly traded company, so there's a whole capital structure there, and right now Molson Coors is paying down debt. They took on about $12 billion to buy the company from SAB Miller, or AB InBev, I guess, buy out the partnership from AB InBev. So capital is tight. I compete with breweries across the world.
Thank you very much, Dick.
Yes, my
What
pleasure.
a fascinating story.
Thank you.